Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. As it goes in this world and business of Zooms, some colleagues will join us undoubtedly in the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes, but it's my pleasure to welcome you. Could you do me the favor at the top of the program, if all of you, if you're in a position to do so, just turn your cameras on for a moment so that we can see you and greet you and appreciate your presence. And I see them going on, and I see David Kramer, and oh my gosh, so many friends and allies and colleagues. What a splendid group. And thank you all for doing that. Now, if you wish to multitask or continue with your gardening, or Michelle, if I may say, you were in a Zoom discussion the other day and we had you in Baltimore in line to be vaccinated. How about that? So if you need to switch your cameras off, you're welcome to do so. But thank you all for being here today. The program is 20 to 30 minutes with me asking questions or interviewing, if you will, our guest of honor, and then the latter part, 30 minutes, give or take, Q&A. We'll have a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. Mike McFaul needs no introduction, so let me introduce you, Mike. Professor McFaul, Ambassador McFaul, Director of the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. Mike, as you all know, is an important former government official, public intellectual. You may not know he's a member of the editorial board of American Purpose, and he's a friend. Mike published, we're privileged to say, 3 substantial articles with us in the time frame December, January, all from his forthcoming book, and all tending to or relating to the question of the reform and future of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. public diplomacy. Let me tell you, if I may, why I think this conversation is so important right now. It is in part because we are all so distracted by all the tasks and tactics and news of the day in a week. It seems to me that we often have a deficit of time to think big picture, forward-leaning, and strategically. It just is life and the way it works. Mike McFaul, you, Mike, bring vision and values to your work, and that's revealed in the 3 substantial essays you wrote for us. But I'm happy to say and delighted to say you bring practical experience. And if you haven't yet read these essays, they are detailed and they are granular and they're specific in very helpful sorts of ways. So with that, Mike, welcome. And I'm going to start by asking you, these were adapted from a forthcoming book. I think you better tell us about the book. And you are on mute. You need to unmute.
For the 4,000th time, I'll take myself off of mute. Thanks for having me, Jeff. Thanks for launching this fantastic journal too. I just want to commend you. I read more of this journal than I have many other journals in recent years. I think it's really in many different ways. We could talk about why your journal is part of what I was writing about, just so you know, the battle for ideas and why we need to engage with them. And then third, thank you for allowing me to publish these 3 articles in sequence, designed to be published during the transition, during the Biden transition. And I know for a fact they circulated quite widely within the transition team. I know that 90% of the ideas were rejected, precisely because of what Jeff just said, that when you're dealing with incoming and you're dealing with the tactical stuff, to think broader and bigger is hard. And I appreciate that. But I was writing for the long haul. And the other thing, I just want to say thank you, Jeff. Some of the ideas in these 3 pieces, I know more about than others. I took a chance, and I think that's a job for us outsiders. I'm looking at Frank and myself, the left coasters who sit out here in California, and with the virtue of not having to be in the day-to-day scrum of Washington, to think provocatively and sometimes to to be more provocative than one even imagines is possible. And I very deliberately did that in my series for you. And as a consequence, I already have received a ton of feedback, including from a lot of people in the US government and a lot of people about whom their entities and organizations and parts of the bureaucracy I was writing. Most of it is all off the record because nobody wants to speak to me on the record. I understand that, but that's been just tremendous for me, Jeff, because these are works in progress for me, both in terms of the policy debates that I continue to do, but they're the ending of a book that the tentative title, they kind of go back and forth, but the tentative title is Autocrats versus Democrats, Lessons from the Cold War for Dealing with China and Russia Today. And in the book, it's kind of three different sections. The first part is very historical. I start with the beginning of the American Republic and relations between China and Russia going all the way back then. And I do so because I want to have something to say about the relationship between three different factors. So it's historical, but that part is the most theoretical, which is what is the relationship between power on the one hand, regime type, and individuals. And the only way you can say something interesting about that is if you get some variation on those variables, right? And the only way you get variation on those variables, in my view, is if you have different regime types in China and Russia in particular that change, and then we can see how the bilateral relationship changes between that troika. The heart of the book is about the debate we're having today about Russia and China, and there again I look at power, regime type, and then I add a section on multilateral institutions. And then the end part of the book is about unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral policies, ideas for helping us to wage and be successful in the battle for the future of liberalism. Now, sometimes, with this crowd, I'm thinking I toggle sometimes back and forth between liberalism and democracy. I'm trying to be a little more disciplined of that, having listened to Frank and read his inaugural article in this journal, to be a little more disciplined about those things. And I'm nervous about that because other people are much more expert about those distinctions than I am. But I'm interested in the entire panoply of what constitutes small L liberalism or small D Democrats, and so those are the three parts of the book.
So, Mike, thank you. We're going to get to the nuts and bolts of your proposals for reform in U.S. diplomacy and public diplomacy in a moment. But while we're there, and incidentally, you should see in chat, thanks to Michelle, links to Mike's pieces. The first one was published on November 25th. And just as you suggest, Mike, you tackle this battle, I think you call it an ideological struggle between the autocrats, the dictators. You talk about Russia, you talk about China. You also mentioned Iran. Could you tell us a little bit about how these problems, how they're comparable, the similarities, but also how you prioritize them and how they're distinct from one another? Also, if I may add the footnote, can you make any comments broadly about how Democrats and Republicans, or conservatives and liberals, are seeing these challenges and threats? You quote early on Bob Kagan, our friend, who, I don't know, you talk about labels at one point. Is he a conservative? Is he a liberal? Is he former neocon? I don't know. You also quote Richard Fontaine, who I think counts as a Republican national security expert. So how do you differentiate when you consider these challenges, and what does our politics suggest about how we pursue different methods or even a bipartisan consensus?
Well, those are two giant important questions, Jeff. First, on the analytic side of those three countries, and by the way, a footnote to that, I originally was writing about all three, Iran, Russia, and China. and my agent and now publisher forced me to push out Iran. The argument was that Iran just does not compare, but for me, analytically, it does. And let me explain it, because it's related to then how I answer the second part of your question. So what's interesting to me as a social scientist about Iran, Russia, and China is that they're all countries that had a set of relations with the United States before revolutions. And then all three of those countries, our relationship with them changed, at least this would be my argument, as a result of those revolutions. And why that is important to me is that that suggests it's not just about power or individual leaders that defines relationships between states. The regime type also matters. And I'm happy to go into the history as you're interested, but those breakage points defined by revolution, I think, are not just blips in the screen or not just decreases in power, as others would argue, especially with respect to China and Russia, but actually the regime type. There's a new regime in place, two communist regimes, one theocratic regime, and that regime type changes the relationship with the United States. And then all three of those countries, to different degrees, are in different phases of post-revolutionary or continued revolutionary moment. And where they're at on that dimension, I think affects how we relate to them. Now, with this crowd, I'll bet you that's not a really controversial statement. I don't know. I don't know everybody here. But just so you know, in academia and the debate about international relations theories, what I just said is a very contentious argument. I would say the dominant paradigm in American academia today is still realism, where the regime type and what happens within states don't matter in terms of relations between states. I have a different view. So that's where I treat that. Now, the other piece, and Jeff, I'm struggling with this, and I welcome lots of conversation about this even today and maybe in the future. The ideological dimension of U.S.-Russia relations and U.S.-China relations are not the same as the ideological dimensions between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. I make that argument in the book, but I'm happy to discuss that. But I'm in between this debate, right? There's one side, I think expressed most loudly at the end of the Trump administration that talks about continuity of Marxism, Leninism with the PRC and the ideological aspiration to take over the world. The different speeches that Secretary Pompeo and others made at the end of their administration. And then, we are entering a new Cold War. Then there's the other side that says, no, this has nothing to do with the Cold War. That's a different argument with respect to China. And I'm in between, very deliberately in between, to say, yes, this is different from the Cold War, but no, it is not purely ideological. Let me put that in a different terms. There is an ideological dimension to the tensions we have with China. And even more controversially, and I'm staring right at you right now, Lilia. You can't see me, but you're looking right at me. I also argue that there's an ideological dimension to our relationship with Russia, and that Putinism and his set of ideas is not just about power and the balance of power between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States, but there is this ideological dimension too. And so that's where I land on the analytic side. On the political side, you're more expert than I am, Jeff, on those debates. All I would say is when I teach a course on American foreign policy here at Stanford. And, I start every year with the 2x2 matrix, where I plot presidents over the last 80 to 100 years. And on one axis is internationalists versus isolationists. On the other axis is liberals versus realists. And, I can put people in all four of those quadrants. I am a liberal internationalist. Just I'm pretty. I'm probably pretty far out there on that dimension compared to most people. But what I would say, I think what we're experiencing in our country today is, and then the next thing I say to all my students is, when you plot that 2x2 matrix, the first thing you need to learn is that Democrats and Republicans fall in all four quadrants. So this notion that we have a Republican foreign policy and Democratic foreign policy, I think is false. It ebbs and flows, it changes over time, but on the Republican side, one of the most important realist presidents we had was Republican Richard Nixon, and one of the most important liberal presidents we had, small L liberal, was Ronald Reagan. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand. So that's why somebody like Richard, you mentioned, ideologically, I'm not sure I'm very far from Richard Fontaine in the way that I think about the world. But within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party, there are both isolationists. They hate that word. They would say retrenchment, and they all would use pragmatism, by the way. Everybody's a pragmatist. Everybody grabs that. We're all pragmatists. I used to have this debate with my old boss, President Obama, all the time. But there's also this realist liberal tension, obviously in the Republican Party, but I would say increasingly within the Democratic Party as well. And part of what I'm trying to address in the book is to make the argument for liberal internationalism again.
Mike, thanks. That's fabulous. Let me take a step further. I mentioned at the top that you are detailed and granular. You describe problems, but you propose things to improve, manage, solve issues. In that first chapter that we were talking about at the moment, which, by the way, was called "You All Dressing for Dinner," we can't reclaim our place at the head of the table if we're dragging our grandfather's State Department with us. You have very specific ideas, Mike, about reform. You say, among other things, that we need diplomats with deeper expertise, both in area study and language. You address the issue of diversity. And if I recall, I think you say, it's astounding, that 4% of American Foreign Service officers are African American. And you also call for a greater infusion or import of expertise from the outside. Can you describe the state of play and then how we get from here to there, your proposals to make and get appreciable improvement?
Yeah, so the first piece is mostly about State Department reform and diplomacy reform, I would say more broadly, because there are other actors in the US government that do diplomacy. I was the ambassador in Moscow for a few years, and the first thing that strikes you as an outsider is you walk into your team meeting. Ours were Tuesdays at 11. I don't think that's a classified number. And, there's 24 agencies at your meeting there, right? NASA's there, Commerce is there, Department of Agriculture is there. I think a lot of Americans don't know that. And the CIA is there, and the FBI is there. There's the other, the Siloviki are also there, just so you know. And they like that word, by the way, to my Russian speaker friends. Siloviki is this word for like hardliners, or I think that's the right way to translate it. And our hardliners like using that term to describe themselves, the power ministries. And, a couple of things, Jeff. So first the State Department and then the bigger circle. And I want to be careful here with modesty to underscore the fact that I'm not a professional diplomat, that I only spent 5 years in the US government. I've interacted with the US government for decades. And I've had this conversation with a couple of Burnses, Ambassador Burns, and many, many other people like them. And I just want to underscore that my thinking on this is evolving as I learn more about things that are done right. So with that that preambular kind of, I'm open to new ideas, let me just say a couple of things that are really striking to me as an outsider working in the State Department that animated a lot of that piece. So first on expertise. There is this notion, a very old notion, that Foreign Service officers are, they're kind of good. They have their degrees from liberal arts colleges and they kind of know a little bit about everything. And they go to the Foreign Service Institute for a while and learn Mandarin, and then they go serve there for a while, and then they come back and they learn Farsi, and then they move around, and we're always worried about clientelism, so we don't want them to get to know any place too well. And I think there was a time and place for that, and most certainly there are some people. I want to be clear about this. I don't want to make a huge generalization that have managed to do that. There's some of them are my former employees and my former students, and it's fantastic. But the 21st century is a really complicated time, in my view. And to get to know, to actually speak Russian. I was going to talk about Mandarin, but let me speak about Russian because I've struggled with that language my whole life. It's a really hard language. It's really hard to learn that language and actually conduct diplomacy, either public or government to government. I had some of the best people in the State Department working for me, so the absolute superstars. And yet I would say just a very small handful of them could actually conduct business in that language. And then I had an army of people that had broken Russian. They were doing their best. It's not about intelligence. It's about time it takes to learn that language. That just couldn't, in my view, perform to the same levels if they were native Russian speakers. So what happens then? They lean on the Russian staff to do the work, because we used to have a lot of really talented Russian staff until all these expulsions happened. But I just think that's just no good in the 21st century. We need deeper expertise. And I feel this especially about China right now. That language is even harder. But it's not just about language, Jeff, as you rightly pointed out. It's about like expertise in other things, cybersecurity. I teach here at Stanford. I'm surrounded by people that know how to code and know how to design things and fight with cybersecurity issues. That's a lot of very in-depth knowledge that you can't learn just at a course or two at the Foreign Service Institute. And here's an analogy. There are some parts of the State Department that we respect that expertise. So, you can see my finger here. I actually broke my finger playing basketball as an ambassador in Moscow. And that bad surgery, by the way, took place in Palo Alto, not in Moscow. I should have stayed in Moscow. But when I broke my finger, I didn't go see a second-year Foreign Service officer who had 6 months of training about medical issues. I went to see a doctor who has been in a specialized part of the Foreign Service for doctors for 30 years. So why can't we think about doing that in other kinds of domain spaces? That's my argument about expertise. Related to that is the walls, I would say, between diplomats and the rest of the working America. There are very few professions in the world left in America today where you spend 30 plus years in your career and you don't move around. State Department is still one of those. And I just don't think that's good. I think they should get out in the world. I think they should do other things. I think they should spend time teaching our students here at Stanford. And conversely, I think more people should do tours within the State Department. And the absurdity that the only time you can do that is at the ambassadorial level. Why is that? I mean, why shouldn't we have, people doing tours 1 or 2 years in and out of the State Department at other levels? And some things are too sensitive, some things are too important. You wouldn't want to have novices doing that. But But we had, for instance, a visiting scholar from the University of Wisconsin working in our with our legal team. She spent her whole career working on rule of law issues. And she was fantastic to have as the team, right? So why not do that? Why not scale that where you have that kind of back and forth? And then the last thing I'll say, I could go on forever. As you know, I wrote many different things, but another really big kind of analytic structural change that I think needs to occur for our diplomacy to be more effective is to rather radically rethink what is the job of a diplomat. When I worked in the Moscow embassy, and the reward structures this way as well in terms of promotions. By the way, I've literally received 100 email messages from people in the State Department about that article, Jeff, just so you know. Some of it critical, but a lot of it, thank you for saying this. But here's one thing. You are rewarded for your cable writing, for your promotion, right? And by the way, some fantastic cables, some fantastic people. What are they doing in that cable writing? They're basically replicating what other academics are writing about Russia, what other journalists are writing about Russia, what other diplomats are writing. And then they're classifying it and they're saying, my source told me this, my source told me that. And don't get me wrong, we need that part of that job. But there's a lot of competition in that space that didn't exist 50 years ago or 70 years ago when Kennan was writing his cables, in terms of the information space, that I don't think our diplomats are as comparatively better off than the other people doing that. That's number one. So I think that's another job, think about a different thing to focus on. And for me, Jeff, it's public diplomacy. I announced this early on in my tenure as an ambassador when I said, you have a public diplomacy cone within the State Department, right? People that specialize in that. And I announced one day to everybody on my team, my senior leadership, I said, I hereby today deputize you all as public diplomacy officers of the State Department. And I said, I want you to conceptually change the way you think of your job is not just reporting back to your desk officer at the State Department or Commerce or USAID, but I want you to think about projecting and explaining what you're doing to the 150 million people that live in the country that we're living in today. And everybody radically reacted against that. And over years, it took years, but we changed that to not everybody agreed with me. I want to be clear. And by the way, I gave a pass to the chief of station, the head of the CIA, said, there's one person in this meeting that doesn't have to be a public diplomacy officer, but everybody else did. And I wanted people to think about their jobs differently. And by the way, just anecdotally, the military folks were some of the best at this, just so you know. I don't think he would mind me telling you his name. The head of the DAT, as they're called, for my second year in Moscow, is a guy named General Zwack. He had he embraced this idea and looked for all kinds of public ways to be out there in society that I thought was brilliant. And especially when we were doing all these anniversaries of World War II, he really leveraged that in a way that I thought was really good in terms of our public diplomacy. By the way, he had a young officer that was his special assistant, Alex Vindman. I think you've heard a lot about him recently. He was also really good at it. The last thing I'll say, sorry, you asked, so you can tell I have a lot to say on this. There's another piece that also I think needs to be rethought, which is the role of the diplomat in actually conducting diplomacy, I think has radically diminished because of technology and communications. And let me just talk about it personally, but you can think about this in many other dimensions. I went from the White House to the embassy, right? I was the most connected ambassador probably that ever has had that job. I had a direct relationship with Barack Obama. He was the guy that asked me to go there. I knew everybody through 3 years of working at the White House. Everybody understood that I was the Russia person, for better, for ill. I have to accept all of it. And yet, when I showed up in Moscow, and this was especially true when Secretary Kerry came on, Secretary Kerry didn't think he had to send me a cable to then march over to see the deputy foreign minister, the Rybkov is his name. I see people who know him here. Great guy, by the way. Sergei and I had a really, to the best of our abilities, I thought a very cordial, important working relationship. But Kerry just pulled out his cell phone and called Lavrov all the time. He didn't think he had to go through this antiquated way. And by the way, we call it a cable, right? We call it a démarche. I mean, these are ancient words from an earlier time. And I just, with technology, with Zoom calls, with, the various things, I just think the role of diplomats is being challenged by these 21st century technologies. And that's why I write about some of these new, different ideas, including first and foremost, this public diplomacy job for diplomats.
Mike, thank you. That was very helpful. The second essay you wrote for us was called Something Like Sometimes You Get Another Chance. It's a critique of the Trump administration getting us out of the democracy promotion business and your argument and method for getting us back in. I'm mentioning that, I'm setting it aside for a moment. I'm going to the third essay you wrote for us, titled Sell It Again, Sam. And it is about public diplomacy, and you were just digging into exactly that. With that, Mike, if you don't mind, I'd like to open it up to our colleagues. And there is at least one question by a colleague. Hal, if you were there, you put a question in chat, identified yourself as a Fulbright semi-finalist, which is wonderful. Congratulations. And I can read your question, but I think it's better for us if we hear directly from you. Hal, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
You have the floor. Tell us who you are. Give us a word or two, 30 seconds or even less, and then ask your question. And welcome.
Yeah, no, I graduated from Temple University last year, and applying for the 2021 cycle, I learned I was a semifinalist in February, and I really hope I get the finalist. But my question is about your third essay, where you speak of the role of the various U.S. public media agencies. And you mentioned VOA, Voice of America, and potentially kind of affiliating that or associating that with PBS. And I was wondering, because one of the points you make is that one of the points of these organizations should be that they should promote the ideas of liberal democracy or spread these things abroad, as well as just provide these unbiased source of news to people around the world. And one of the problems we're facing right now, and this is what my essay is about, of course, is that social media is making it really difficult for people to come around a common set of truth and facts. And I was just wondering, to what extent could these agencies play a very similar role within the United States, or should they, given the fact that historically the United States has been reluctant to kind of use these instruments in that way within the country?
Yeah, thanks, Hal, and good luck with Fulbright. I also was a Fulbright scholar, and I'm a huge Fulbright fan, and I would, expand the money, and I would at least start our China program again. I think the Trump folks suspended it for a while. This is the topic I have the least confidence to speak about, and now I'm staring right at you, Jeff, because I want you to jump in as well. And I'm still evolving in my views, but a couple of things I would say. One is, as I write in the article, I think we need to have a much harder firewall between what some call surrogate media operations. Some people don't like those words, but let's just use RFERL as an example, but there are many others there. And VOA and other government public diplomacy pieces. I think there's been a blurring over time of those different VOA and RFERL and Radio Free Asia, and I don't think that served our interests well. And my radical idea is to push out all of the surrogate media entities at USAGM, give them their independent boards. Preferably, they had direct money from the U.S. Congress. I like the NED model as the way to set it up, if you could get to that. And so that they have much more autonomy, not just perceptually, but actually in reality. And I think one of the lessons from the Cold War was the success of RFERL. And part of its success is that it was, close. It was in Munich, and it had. And I'm feeling sheepish talking about this with this crowd looking at me, who know that history better than I do. But that is what we need, and so the reporting is about Russia and Belarus and Georgia and Ukraine, and not about advocating for U.S. policy, which they don't do. It's VOA that I think is confused about its messaging and its what it does. Just as an example, the other day when Mr. Biden said what he did about Putin, I got a call from Radio Liberty, VOA, and four other journalists, I hope I'm using that word properly, that are paid for by the US government. And why is that? Why, to me, it seems like the VOA mission and the RFE mission should be different. And so that's what I think. I think they should be different. And I think VOA should go back to one of its core missions, which is explaining America and explaining US foreign policy, and not try to pretend to be an independent media organization. I just don't think that is right. I don't think it works. And that would mean, by the way, a pretty radical change with respect to some fantastic resources we have in Africa and Latin America, where you would take Voice of America Africa and make it look and act more like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia. That's my radical proposal on that front. Now, Hal, the thing you mentioned, I think is too radical for us. I just want to, I throw out some ideas that I know have no, I think it has a very little chance of succeeding, but the alternative model would be a BBC-like structure. And that's what I meant about fusing PBS with some entity like that. But that's not in the cards in the year 2021 right now.
So Hal, thank you. Mike, thanks very much. I have Richard and I have Nicole. I'm going to permit myself, since you invited me, Mike, to add a parenthetical. At the end of the Cold War, Václav Havel said, from Voice of America, I learned about America and the world. And from RFERL, I learned about my own country, a closed society. Somewhat analogously, but certainly not perfectly identical. When I was running RFERL, I would have a member of Congress say to me, does your Afghan unit know anything about the Taliban? And I'd say, Senator, we have a bureau in Kabul, stringers in all 34 provinces. They speak Dari and Pashto natively. They drink tea with the Taliban every day. What better way to communicate to the local population and understand and collect information intelligence, if you will. Richard, could we go to you next? You had if you're still, you were there, you had a question in chat about exchange programs, and Mike does deal with that in these three essays, and the utility, but maybe also the problem or peril with Chinese and Russian students who come here in natural sciences. Now, of course, I just gave you a question, but you could do it better and you have the floor. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Richard Hanrahan. I'm actually a retired Foreign Service officer. And before retiring, I actually was ACS chief in Moscow. So
oh, wow.
I actually liked your idea of having a lot of officers rotate into the ACS section. I think that was, it's a great idea. But sort of over the years, in addition to doing ACS work, I also did a lot of visa work. And over the years, as I've become concerned about, I mean, I think it's tremendous to have Russians, Iranians, Chinese come to the United States and study, but I was a little concerned about the security aspects of some of this, and it cuts both ways. And I just wanted to, you advocated a bit of an expansion of that, but I wanted to have you talk a little bit about the drawbacks and how do you think you address those?
Yeah, Richard, it's a really hard question. And as you might imagine, we here at Stanford University, it's not an abstract problem for us. It's one we are wrestling with in conversation with the US government all the time. You know, philosophically, I am of the view that knowledge and science does not have passports, and that when we try to control that, we'll fail. And you know, I'm writing my syllabus right now, for instance, for my course I have to teach next quarter. I'm not looking at, you know, just selecting American authors. I'm not looking at all at who the authors are. I'm looking at the substance of the ideas that are there that I want to put there. And I think it's a dangerous slope to go down to say we're going to try to control science or knowledge based on national identity, but with some caveats. One, you know, we don't do classified research here at Stanford, and that's a good baseline. That if you don't do classified, then that's not our problem. Instead, it's the problem of the U.S. government. And you know, seriously, this is a dilemma we're wrestling with all the time here. We do not have the capabilities as a university, and you know, we have a lot of resources compared to most universities. We don't have the capabilities to screen students to know who's an intelligence officer, who works for the PLA and who's not. That ultimately has to be, you know, the job of the U.S. government. And so we are trying really hard to say, once they get a visa, that's decided by the government, then they should be free to do whatever they want here at Stanford University. That's where you try to draw the line. Now, in practical terms, we know that the system, you know it better than anybody probably, that system is not 100%, you know, it doesn't catch every intelligence officer. And we know that knowledge is more fungible, obviously. But I kind of just believe that science, ultimately, you can't control it. But that doesn't mean, so with students, that's where I come down. That does not mean, however, that we don't need industrial policy, that we don't need export controls, not expert controls, export controls. And I think a much more sophisticated way to deal with more sensitive technologies for national security purposes. And but I would not put that in. I don't think that's the burden of the Department of Computer Science at Stanford. I think that's the burden of the US government. And the second thing I would say on that is the other way around. I should be careful of making sweeping generalizations, but let me just say, I'm generally alarmed at the diminishing expertise we have on other countries abroad. How is that for a diplomatic way to put it? Which is to say, because of trends in American social sciences, in particular, we devalue deep knowledge about individual countries. And I think in the long term, that threatens American national security interests. I'm particularly focused on debates about China right now. And I want that debate about the nature of the Chinese regime and the nature of, what China is doing in Africa. I wrote my PhD, a zillion years ago about Soviet and American competition in Southern Africa. And, at the end of the Cold War, we had real deep expertise on very small pieces of like Soviet-Angolan relations, right? Like we had a lot of people who knew a lot about that. And I'm nervous that we don't have that depth of expertise about China right now. Not only about the nature of the system internally, which is hard to understand, but how it operates in places like Africa. And so I want to make sure that we continue not only to worry about the foreign students coming here, but doing more to create the incentives for Americans to go study abroad, despite the increasing challenges that come with that proposition.
Thank you very much.
So thank you both very much, Richard and Mike. Here we are. We have 12 minutes left. So it is with the best of conversations, time flies, and we want to keep Ambassador McFaul and all of you on time, on schedule. Let's see if we can get two in. I want to start with Nicole Penn and then Yulia Zhozha. If you could both be succinct. Nicole, you first. You're a member of the editorial board. Say a word about yourself and then ask away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Penn. I'm a program manager here at the American Enterprise Institute and on the editorial board of American Purpose. So Ambassador McFaul, this has been a great conversation. I'm speaking in my capacity as a diplobrat. My dad was a public affairs officer in the State Department for 30 years. And I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, and Venezuela, actually, from 2004 to 2007. And I think what I'm really intrigued here with your thoughts on the future of public diplomacy is this idea of, having enough time to cultivate deep relationships. I mean, something that I remember very clearly from Venezuela was my dad hosting these cocktail parties with local reporters, and that being really critical to his work. And he actually got a commendation from the US for getting in trouble with the Venezuelan government. They accused him of spreading lies amongst reporters. So I'm wondering if what you're advocating isn't so much something new, but almost a return to the early 20th century, late 19th century conception of the diplomat who stays somewhere for maybe 10 years, 7 to 10 years. Is that something that you think is feasible or desirable, or if that fits in with your paradigm? Thank you very much.
Great, Jess, should I answer that or take the two questions together?
Let's take Mike, very valid, useful point. Yulia, let's get you in. We'll get Ambassador McFaul to reply, and then we'll see if we have time for others. But let's get you in right now.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Ambassador. I teach European security at Georgetown, and I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. I wanted to ask regarding something that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you were focusing or a part of your book on, and that is the U.S. relationship with different regimes and how that influences the relationships itself. And I couldn't agree more, but could you tell us a little bit more about how we can think about the US strategic relationships and diplomacy in general in the context of the upcoming Global Democracy Summit? Where I'm from, Eastern Europe, that's a lot of concern because the risk that is perceived, especially in that region, is that the United States or the administration will tend to put into one category countries that are not black or white, but in the gray zone, all the way from Turkey, Erdogan's anti-Americanism, but we need Turkey. I would argue the United States needs Turkey to a certain extent as an important new power, and all the way then to Poland, and in discussions around that. Is that a true democracy, or how are we to think about these relationships? Thank you.
Yeah, both great questions. Where did I just lost? Where did Emma go?
To me, Nicole, the first question.
Where did Nicole go? I'm sorry. Nicole's off camera. Okay. Let me take Nicole's question first, and then Yulia's next. That'll be a good way for us to end. Yes, Nicole, I want to be clear. I am talking about augmenting traditional public diplomacy, not replacing it. Some of the best events I did at Spasa House were very traditional events with, musical groups from America. I'm from Montana. One of the first groups we had perform at Spasa House was a country western band from Montana. My father's actually a country western musician, And it's a long story I read about in my book, but we had this culture clash of Spaso House culture versus Montana culture. And I got in a big argument with the woman who runs the house. I said, we don't have any place to dance here, Olga. And she said, Mr. Ambassador, we don't dance at Spaso House. And I said, Olga, Montanans dance to country Western music. And so we compromised and we took a few chairs out. And by the way, she was right. Nobody was dancing. Everybody was sitting on their hands. Everybody's in their ties and everything. And finally, my wife and I, some of you know, Donna, we got up, and I don't do the two-step well, but I know how to do the two-step. And within about 30 seconds, the place just completely exploded. And all kinds of people, including people that really do not like American foreign policy, members of the Duma and members of the Russian government were out there trying to do the two-step too. And so I'm with you completely. That's one dimension. But then we tweeted about it, right? Then we advertised it. Then we showed these folks interacting with us there. And that was important to, to be able to communicate about that in a more, a broader way. I'm also just reminded, part of my strategy, just because I'm looking at Lilia again, my friend Lilia Shevtsova, remembering Lilia, a dinner that you were at with Mr. Pushkov, if I'm not mistaken. And I always, Nicole, just so you know, despite my reputation, I was willing to engage with a very wide range of people in Moscow, including even Mr. Zhirinovsky, who made it for the first time ever to a July 4th party at Spaso House, and actually kind of cornered my son in a big argument about what we would call liberalism and illiberalism. But I also engaged with, members of the Putin propagandists, I would call them. But I made them engage with people that didn't agree with them, including Lilia Shevtsova at a very memorable dinner I remembered where we debated these things. And I thought that was also part of what we're supposed to do as public diplomacy diplomats, to allow those kind of conversations and interactions to take place. And then finally, on the longer term, there's a balance, and I don't know what the right place is. But I do think we need some rethinking about our common conceptions about moving people out after 3 years or moving them around. And don't get me wrong, I worry about clientitis too. And we had a lot of tensions in my embassy about that, where I was very uncomfortable, and to the point where, we had some pretty big arguments about it, that we could not pretend to be the friends of the Russian government and leave all the bad, tough messaging to the State Department in Washington. Because some of my diplomatic friends said, well, our job is to be friends with these people so that we can get to know them and gather intelligence. And, there's a mix between that. But I always felt like we had to have one policy. Having said that, I see the advantages of people in places longer. I just saw my old colleague, Mr. Denisov, who is the current ambassador for Russia in China. He's been there for like a decade, speaks fluent Mandarin, knows everybody. That gives him advantages in terms of doing his job compared to people that come in and out and don't have those relationships. So I don't know what the right balance is, but I'm pretty convinced that we don't have it right the way we're currently configured. And I also strongly, just to underscore one last time, we do not leverage our resources for public diplomacy to the full scale that we can. Some people think I went too far in the way that I did that. That's fine, maybe I did. But to go back to, what I think is a kind of a sleepy strategy right now, just does not serve America's national interests, in my view. I think we're just not utilizing people and resources to the way that we should. Finally, Yulia, on your question about the Global Democracy Summit and where the lines are on that, those are all really hard questions. And my view is we have to think conceptually of this ideological moment we're in today, and I do think we are in one, as not being between just democratic countries and autocratic countries, but between Democrats, small d Democrats, and small l liberals versus the enemies of liberalism and the enemies of Democrats. Because I would argue in my own country, and I would argue throughout most of Europe, that battle is not between, it is between countries, but it's also within countries. And most certainly Vladimir Putin thinks in those terms. He's cultivating his ideological friends throughout Europe and the world. And I think we have to have a more sophisticated strategy to do that ourselves. And part of that gets back to much more philosophical things about what is the meaning of liberalism and why it's valuable, what is valuable about democracy. You know, the mission of the American purpose is exactly what I think should be a much bigger dimension of this. And so with that Global Democracy Summit, for instance, I think it'll be a failure if it's all dominated by government officials. I think that'll be a giant failure. And instead, it should be a summit of small d Democrats, and some of them might happen to be presidents and prime ministers. Some of them might happen to be NGO activists in other parts of the world. Some of them might happen to be academics and professors and analysts, right? And I think thinking of it that way, as opposed to this kind of structured government to government thing, might be a much more powerful thing to do, number one, so that we underscore that we're united by our ideas, not by our positions and our the governments or not. And that too, you'll sidestep what is the very tricky problem that the community of democracies had before, and I know they're facing today, who qualifies to be here or not, you know, the Turkeys and Hungaries of the world, where that creates unnecessary tension over those issues. I just think if you frame it in this way and really get back to the ideas of liberalism and democracy, that might be a better footing upon which to have that summit that they're planning.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, Julia, thank you, and Mike and colleagues, thank you. An hour goes fast. On the one issue, if I may add, and I've seen internal chat now with Nicole, and you touched on this throughout, Mike, this issue of going native. I've always been of the view that you have to go native, and then you have to be able to climb back out again. But if you don't go native in the first part to intimately understand language, people, history, culture, it's a problem and disservice. Listen, you all, two thoughts in close. One is,
Jeff, before you get to that, I want to tell you, you just reminded me of an anecdote apropos of that. You know, at one of the high points of me getting in trouble with Putin, he's a guy, he doesn't really like me, and I don't really like him. So, but there was a moment when, you know, I was even being informally told, you know, you might get kicked out of the country and, you know, suffer the fate of George Kennan. And one of my friends, I'm not going to name the person, but who was an intermediary, who knows Putin pretty well. He knows actually Putin very well, but he's known me for 30 years. And he said to me, you know, Mike, your real problem with Putin is that you love Russians too much. You know too much Russian history. You know too much Russian culture. That's what drives him nuts. If you were just some Cold Warrior, you know, Brzezinski type anti-Russian person, it'd be much more comfortable. Your problem is you like Russia too much. And you just reminded me of that. So I wanted to share that with you.
well, of course, and he knows what you know, and you touch nerves. You have a finger on things precisely. So thank you for adding that, Mike. So you all, two things in close. Before I ask Mike a last question, which is short, sweet, and simple, believe it or not, simple. If you're inclined, would you turn your cameras back on so that we could see you and say hi and wish you a good afternoon and evening? It is nice to see you all. You know, we've gone from Zoom isolation to Zoom cameras off isolation. And so it's good to see you all. Thank you very much for the valuable time. Mike, my last question is, and this was stimulating, informative, inspiring. Thank you, thank you. The book, when can we buy it? When can we read it?
Well, it's interesting you say, Jeff. It's actually related to the sequence of these articles. I originally was hoping to submit it to the publisher. I have a publisher, the same publisher that published my last book, May 1st. But I've decided I'm not ready to do that because I have more to learn. And so I've pushed it back to the end of the year in large measure because of the reaction I've gotten from the articles that I published with you. I want to digest and learn and refine those ideas. So my suspicion is it'll come out sometime next spring. But that's an invitation to you all. If you have other ideas, please, be in touch. I'm McFaul at stanford.edu, and I am in a learning phase right now before I get to the writing phase for the final parts of this book. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Mike, for that invitation. And Michelle High, our managing editor, it sounds like the door is cracked there to commission a next article or a series of 3 from Ambassador Mike McFaul. Listen, everybody, thanks for valuable time. I'm sorry we didn't get everybody in. It was a great, great conversation. Mike, thanks. A privilege to spend the hour with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.